So why are so many people rock hard, just paralyzingly turgid for causing a nuclear war? In part, it's because there's a widespread belief in America that the US would not only survive nuclear war, but would be totally fine. Because the US has been more or less totally fine and free from the majority of the consequences of even traditional warfare, pretty much since its inception. Back in February, Joy Behar lamented to her co-host on The View that the conflict between Russia and Ukraine was going to interrupt her plans to vacation in Italy. If the nukes start flying, it's going to interrupt more than a few European vacations, and I don't mean viewings of the film European Vacation. I don't only mean that. The point is, that's the level of consideration some American people generally have for global conflict and the threat of nuclear war. At best, it doesn't seem real to us because we never experienced the majority of the effects of war, because the US is an island far distant from the rest of the world's superpowers. We don't face the regular threat of invasion. We've never fought a modern war on our own soil. There's barely been any wars fought in America except against ourselves and the British. Twice. But Cornwallis wasn't sitting on a nest of ICBM silos at Yorktown, and the Brits didn't drop a nuke on the White House in the War of 1812. War is long, ugly, violent chaos that decimates the population and brings cities to ruin. The United States has simply never experienced that on a modern scale. So we think things like no-fly zones and sanctions and drone strikes and bombing raids and casually suggesting nuclear conflict aren't a huge deal. Or perhaps these people are daring nuclear war because they do know what it means, but also think that America is somehow destined to come out on top. It's an idea called dispensationalism, first popularized by evangelical writer and right-wing Uber twerp Hal Lindsey, and is derived from the Bible. Basically, a nuclear war would wipe the slate clean for the whole planet, and America would emerge victorious and in more or less the same condition, ready to reshape the world and lead it into a glorious future under the rule of King America. That's batshit. Like objectively guano. If that had come out of Skeletor's mouth, Beastman would have called an ambulance. And yet, you could argue that the belief in a righteous Armageddon isn't at all fringe, and in fact, was shared by at least one modern president of the United States. You can probably guess which one. So with all of that in mind, I sure think we need to take a moment and explain what a nuclear bomb actually does. Are we all ready? It's a brand new segment that we're calling... Wow, that was perfect. Perfect segment title. Okay, so here's what a nuclear bomb actually does, because it seems like entirely too many people need a refresher. The immediate detonation of a nuke creates a fireball of plasma 1 mile across that is hotter than the sun. You know the one. Anything caught within that fireball just vaporizes. And I'm not being cheeky or hyperbolic. I mean, it literally actually vaporizes. People, buildings, trees, microbuses, bike messengers, pizza rats, groundhogs, hedgehogs, mustaches, overdue library books, promptly returned library books. Everything is just gone. The explosion creates a flash of light that generates a plasma wave that stretches out for as far as 8 miles from the blast, which is powerful enough to ignite everything it touches. So that means everything within about 200 square miles is now on fire, in roughly 1 second. That's like an episode of Dragon Ball Z where everyone was drunk. Godzilla couldn't put up those numbers, and not just because he doesn't exist. Then, a shockwave of wind stronger than any hurricane or tornado in recorded history flattens the area in the immediate vicinity of the blast. And although the shock wave weakens just a tiny bit as it expands outward, it's still strong enough to obliterate most houses and non-reinforced buildings for up to 175 square kilometers or nearly 70 miles. The mushroom cloud we're all so rock hard to see is a plume of dust and ash that used to be the population of a city. And that mushroom cloud sucks in even more air and debris like a vacuum, laying waste to anything left standing. And the casualties of this are arguably the lucky ones. The explosion isn't the sole point of a nuke, and while this humble news merchant apparently made the foolish f***ing mistake of believing that was common knowledge, it evidently needs to be repeated for the cheap seats. You know, the ones occupied by literal presidents and senators. A nuke's long game is fallout, basically to scorch the earth by poisoning an entire population center with radiation. The fallout risk is greatest during the first 48 hours after the explosion. Roughly half of the people exposed to radiation in the direct vicinity of the blast will die of radiation poisoning. Those who don't die right away can linger for days or weeks, ultimately succumbing to either an obliterated immune system unable to fight infections, or their digestive systems literally shutting down. Other survivors exposed to fallout are at an extremely high risk of developing cancer for the rest of their lives. According to the International Committee of the Red Cross, more than 10,000 survivors of the nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki have been treated over the past 70 years, with most of the deaths in this group attributed to some form of cancer. Leukemia rates in the survivors who were exposed to radiation were 4 to 5 times higher than the typical levels for the first 15 years after the bombs were dropped. It's important to note that the fallout in Japan was local, meaning it was confined to the blast zones. But we have spent the past 80 years supersizing these things like a fry cook on acid. Modern nuclear weapons have gotten exponentially more devastating and launch radioactive dust into the stratosphere, which allows for global fallout. Then there's nuclear winter. Just 100 of the bombs, the size of the ones the US used to heroically murder generations of people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, would lower global temperatures enough to cause a mini ice age, in which Manny, Sid, and the charming rat beast are all drenched with bone cancer. The sudden extreme drop in temperature would trigger a global famine by destroying crops and destabilizing agriculture. Current nuclear bombs are over 50 times more powerful than the 2 dropped on Japan in 1945, which means it would only take 2 of those to plunge the entire planet into nuclear winter. And even if the blast were smaller or less nukey, there's still the problem of fallout poisoning agriculture. In a 2017 interview with Live Science, provoked by the famous fire and fury rant then President Trump hooted out of his Malebolgian windhole, co-director emeritus at Stanford University's Center for International Security and Cooperation, Michael May, said that in a place like Ukraine, which produces 10% of the world's wheat supply, fallout could contaminate the crops and the soil, passing delicious cancer onto any people or livestock who consume it, potentially for several years after the blast. This isn't classified information. We made an entire series of best-selling video games about this exact concept and literally called it Fallout. So anyway, that's what a nuke does. Currently, Russia has around 4,500 nuclear warheads, along with 2,000 smaller tactical nuclear warheads. So maybe we should keep that in mind. Hope that helps. This has been... Yeah, dull it. Kill the bad brain, sweet juice. Okay, so to date, the United States is the only country in history to have used nuclear weapons, and Western mass media has been doing a bang-up job of minimizing that fact for the past 80 years. The US heavily censored images of the devastation, so much so that the first uncensored photos showing the true human cost of the bombings didn't appear in Western media, specifically in Life magazine, until 1952, 7 years after the bombs were dropped. If you took history in an American classroom, you were taught that the bombs were a necessary evil, that they brought a swift end to what would have been a long and bloody war. That necessary evil justification continues to fuel the narrative around the bombings, but the Pacific War leading up to the bombings is rarely discussed. The US was already routinely firebombing Japanese towns and cities, including one campaign that killed over 100,000 civilians in Tokyo within 48 hours. Also, Russia had just declared war on Japan, and there were even reports surfacing just a month before the nukes were dropped that Japan was mulling over a surrender. Hitler and Mussolini had both been dead for months, and Germany had surrendered back in May. The Axis had already broken up, with no possibility of a reunion tour with its original lineup. The war was winding down, no matter what any of these monsters in the highest level of government may claim. Then, as now, America just really wanted to drop some fucking nukes, and for the rest of the world to see them do it, framing the bombings as the key to ending World War II, insisting that killing hundreds of thousands of civilians was justified because it might have saved untold lives, really just means it might have saved untold American and British lives. And we happily agreed with that version of events. 85% of America approved of the bombings in 1945. And I mean, They kind of had to approve, right? Otherwise, we'd have to realize that our country conducted one of the most unnecessary massacres known to humankind. Not to say any massacre is necessary. Meanwhile, President Harry Truman claimed he was following a utilitarian approach when he decided to greenlight the attack, as in, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of anyone who isn't American. You know, that thing Spock said. Incidentally, Truman referred to the, quote, Japs as ruthless and fanatic savages in his personal diary, but I'm sure that had nothing to do with his decision. The atomic bomb dropped over Hiroshima killed 80,000 people instantly. The one over Nagasaki killed 40,000 people instantly. The two cities were chosen primarily because they were large urban centers that would maximize devastation. According to declassified documents, Hiroshima was selected in part because it was surrounded by hills that would focus and increase the blast damage considerably. And on the morning of August 6, 1945, the United States flew a plane into Hiroshima and dropped the most horrible weapon in human history directly on top of a hospital. That's not a joke. There's a memorial there now and everything. In fairness, it was supposed to hit a bridge, but the bomb drifted by 800 feet, so we didn't mean to nuclear bomb a hospital, we meant a nuclear bomb immediately next to a hospital. Hey, thanks for watching that clip. Here's the evergreen end plate to ask you to like and subscribe. It's any day of the year where you are.